Welcome students to Chapter 2, The Crime Scene, Field Notes, Documenting and Reporting. In this chapter we're going to be looking at the proper structure of a police report that begins with the initial complaint followed by the details of the crime. Crime scene photography and videos should include close-up, medium range, and general views. Field notes begin when an investigator gets to the scene and are used in recalling memory and also helps you in writing reports. And also capturing a crime scene on digital video requires recording the perimeter followed by walking closer and closer to the specific objects. The crime scene sketch contains distance measurements as well as information on the case and officer identification. Basically, we're going to be looking at outlining the proper structure of a police report. The elements of a police report include who the officer was met by at the crime scene, what the officer found at the crime scene, what the officer did at the scene, i.e. administered first aid, treated the victims, arrested a suspect, so forth, so on. Describing the injuries to the victim or suspect, type of weapons or weapon that was used, description of all evidence, names and identifiers of all suspects arrested, and names of all witnesses. Remember that witnesses can soon turn out to be a suspect as your investigation continues. Copies of written statements given by witnesses are basically the elements that are contained in a police report. The initial complaint would be a complainant made by the victim's family or the victim themselves, which includes the type of crime, the date, a case number, which would be assigned by various departments. They usually include the year that it happened, the officer's name, suspect's name and address, the victim or victims, synopsis of the crime, details of the crime, and any attachments that would be applicable to the initial complaint. When to take notes. The investigative process begins as soon as an officer gets a call to the scene of a crime. The note-taking process also begins at this time. Officers should remember that note-taking is a continual process that occurs throughout the duration of an officer's involvement in an investigation. The keys to field note-taking and taking notes is that you need to be dealing strictly with the facts. For example, the person's name, what the person stated or what they told you is what you want to write down as the facts of what happened. He stated, or the victim stated, that the following items were missing from the residence. Could be a Samsung 42-inch stereo television, serial number not known. Most of the time people do not have their serial numbers handy. Basically black in color, value $900. Or a gold watch with brown leather band, and then also the brand name, if it's a Seiko, etc. Again, no serial numbers. We want to indicate the date and times and location of where the crime occurred. If there were any wounds or injuries, we want to describe those. For example, you might have a gunshot wound. It'd be 1/4 inch in diameter to the left temple and 1.5 inches from the left eye. A dark gray circle, about 1/4 inch in diameter, surrounds the entire wound. Overall description of the crime scene, you might need to notify or indicate in your notes that there was a broken window or an open door. These types of things are what you want to document in field note-taking. Also, when you take photographs, it's very important that you make sure that the lighting at the crime scene is bright enough in order to take the pictures. And you want to photo everything that you can. The more photos you take, the better off you are. And in any weapons that are found, you want to indicate the type and location of each piece of evidence. For example, you might want to indicate that it was a 9mm caliber S&W, which would stand for Smith & Wesson, model 669 semi-automatic handgun, nickel-plated with wooden grips, serial number 36348, etc. Once you've collected the information about the crime scene, the informants and witnesses, and have taken your notes, it's time to organize this information and prepare your incident report. Once you have done that, you also need to proofread. It's always best to do a rough draft and then proofread and evaluate your final report. It's good to use field interview cards. One of the most successful methods of documenting information on the street is through the use of field interview cards. These are used when patrol officers happen on people or circumstances that appear suspicious, but there is not significant cause for arrest. The FI card is used to document the names, addresses, and other pertinent information. At the end of the officer's watch, he or she turns in the FI cards and they are filed for future reference. It's always good to have a field note system, and every officer is going to basically do it have their own system. But what I like to do is have a spiral notebook in my pocket and jot down information as it occurs while you're on duty. This also helps you stay organized and remember key points, things that happen throughout the day or the night or whatever. Also, you want to make sure that you don't put anything bias, or contradictory information, like saying, "Oh man, that woman was fat," or "Boy, he smelled funny." You don't want to form your own opinions and indicate bias into your field note taking, because your field notes can be subpoenaed and brought into court, and most defense attorneys will tear you apart when you don't stick to the facts. So just a word of caution in that area. So, using field notes in the courtroom, it is acceptable for a person who did not prepare the field notes to testify about their reliability, provided that the person was present at the time the notes were written. It is also acceptable for officers to use their notes to refresh their memory before testifying in court. And that's one of the things that I used to do all the time, is use my notes prior to going to court. Also, it's very important from a legal sense that your original notes are the ones that you want to use when you go to court, whenever possible. So that way you don't get accused of altering your notes. So remember, the 5 steps in report writing are: collect information about the crime scene, informants, and witnesses. Take complete notes. Organize the information. Prepare the report. And proofread and evaluate the report. Official reports should exhibit the following: factuality, thoroughness, getting to the point, accuracy, objectivity, proper word choice. Photographs as evidence. The principal requirements to admit a photograph into evidence are relevance and authentication. In general, a photograph is admitted into evidence at the discretion of the trial judge. In rare cases, a chain of custody is required, or the best evidence rule may be invoked if the photograph is offered for its truth and is the basis of a controlling issue in the case. The most important requirement is authentication. Specifically, the party seeking to introduce the photograph into evidence must be prepared to present testimony that the photograph is accurate and correct. The 3 types of photography methods are general views, medium range views, and close-up views. General views. The general photograph is a sweeping view of the crime scene area, that is, an overall scene, such as the neighborhood, including angles from all streets leading up to the crime scene. It demonstrates that what the crime scene looks like in his own environment. Examples would be a photo of a bank that was robbed, a photo of a house that was burglarized, abandoned getaway car in a wooded area. Medium range views. As we move in closer to the subject of the crime scene, additional photos should be taken. These photos should be taken at a distance no greater than 20 feet away from the subject or item being photographed. The intent of the medium range photo is to depict specific items or objects in the crime scene. Close-up views. Moving from the broad to specific, the last phase in photography or photographing the crime scene is the close-up. These photos are taken at a distance of less than 5 feet using the zoom feature on any digital camera, and they should focus on small segments of a larger surface or on specific objects in the scene. Some examples would be bullet holes in a wall, weapons, blood spatter stains, latent fingerprints, and so on. Some of the disadvantages that we have with crime scene photos is that they don't show the true or actual distances, and they can distort color and perceptions, and it can be ruined by mechanical errors in processing. It's also important to use markers. Markers such as these, the little tents with the numbers on them, are included in the finished photograph and call attention to specific objects or enable the viewer of the photograph to get a sense of the size of the object or the distance between objects. It's very important to take crime scene photos with markers and also without markers, and also with rulers and without rulers. Perspective. It is important that the crime scene photographer show the relationship between one item of evidence and another. This is accomplished by showing the location of the articles in accordance with recognizable backgrounds. In the event that an item to be photographed is smaller than 6 inches, 2 photographs should be taken. The first should be taken at close range, and the second should be taken from at least 6 feet away. This portrays the object in proper perspective. As I mentioned earlier, suitable lighting is important. As a rule, natural light at the scene is inadequate and artificial lighting is required. Avoid all unnecessary shadows, since shadows tend to hide details. Also, since the part of the photo is closest to the flash may be washed out and details lost, strategically use of floodlights to ensure consistent illumination is recommended. Chalk can also be used for making markings to indicate objects such as bodies, footprints, and weapons. Ink markings made on the surface of photographs after they have been printed also is important to do. Alternatively, a transparent overlay containing all necessary arrows, circles, etc. to depict relevant information may be placed over a photograph. Video recording should precede the taking of still photographs. Use a slow panorama of the crime scene, recording from the extreme parameters. Use a tripod or keep the video at eye level. Prejudicial images. Any photograph or image admitted must not represent prejudice or appeal unfairly to the emotions of the jury. Some judges have suppressed photos depicting unusually gruesome crime scenes. In one recent case, photographs were taken of a defendant immediately after being arrested, showing him as dirty and unkempt. These photos were offered as evidence to contrast the defendant's clean and polished image in the courtroom. The judge refused to admit the image into evidence on the basis that it was prejudicial. As I mentioned earlier, field notes begin when the officer gets called to the crime scene. Most information can be learned by asking who, what, when, where, why, and how. Field note essentials for all police officers include recording the dates, times, and locations, description of victims, wounds on the victims or victim, overall description of the crime scene, notes on photographs taken, type and location of evidence, absence of any items, Here's a sample of a crime scene field notes from a officer. I think I went over some of these earlier. When using digital video, you must record the parameter walking closer and closer to the specific objects in question. Use the freeze frame feature to allow viewers to stop the recording at a critical point for a closer view of the subject being documented. Make individual photographs directly from digital video, which could be useful to the investigation. The crime scene sketch complements photographs and videos taken at the scene. With increased use of video and digital cameras at crime scenes, one might argue that preparation of the sketch is no longer needed. In actuality, because videos and photos may tend to distort the dimensions of the crime scene, a properly prepared crime scene sketch is all the more important to a properly documented crime scene. There are generally two types for every crime scene, a rough sketch and a finished sketch. The rough sketch is the one drawn by officers on the crime scene. Generally, it is not drawn to scale, but should reflect accurate dimensions and distances between objects of importance. At times, it might be necessary to draw more than one rough crime scene sketch. For example, one sketch might portray the overall scene, and the second sketch could show only the body and its immediate surroundings. Alterations to the rough sketch should not be made after the investigator leaves the scene. The finished sketch is simply a completed sketch drawn to scale. This is drawn from information contained on the rough sketch and should accurately reflect all measurements indicated on the rough sketch. With the finished sketch being drawn to scale, however, it is not necessary to include the specific measurements on the sketch itself. If the finished sketch is not drawn to scale, measurements are required. Finished sketches need not be prepared by the crime scene investigator, although in court the investigator will be required to affirm that the finished sketch is an accurate portrayal of the scene. In many cases, the finished sketch is prepared by a professional draftsperson or is made with the use of specifically designed computerized programs. The key essentials to sketching crime scenes, they all should include the investigator's name and rank, date, time, crime, case number, the names of other officers that were there at the scene, location of the crime scene, scale of the drawing, for example, 1 inch equals 2 feet, etc. so on. Physical evidence, and then also a key legend indicating what the items are contained or shown in the crime scene. There are three main methods of crime scene sketching: coordinate method, the cross projection method, and the triangulation method. The coordinate method uses the practice of measuring an object from two fixed points of reference. One such procedure is the baseline technique, in which a line is drawn between two known points. The baseline could also be a wall or a mathematically derived point along a designated area where exact measurements can be determined. The cross projection method is used in indoor crime scenes. It is basically a top-down view of the crime scene with the walls of the room folded down to reveal locations of bullet holes, blood spatter evidence, and so on, which would not be apparent otherwise. Measurements are then made from the designated point on the floor to the area on the wall in question. The triangulation method is a bird's-eye view of the scene that uses fixed objects from which to measure. This is particularly useful for sketching outdoor crime scenes where there are no easily identifiable points of reference. In this procedure, two or more widely separated points of reference are required. The item of interest is then located by measuring along a straight line from the reference points. This is an example of the baseline or coordinate method. This is an example of a cross projection method, and this is a triangulation method, and this is the one we tend to use for outdoor crime scenes. And we have to use fixed points like a tree that's not going to be readily moved anytime soon, or a stationary fixed fence or a shed, so we key on those points wherever we can. Summarizing Chapter 2, police reports should include who the officer encountered at the crime scene, what was found there, what the officer did there, a description of injuries to the victim or suspect or suspects, the type of weapons used, a description of all evidence, names, identifiers of all suspects and witnesses, and the copies of written statements given by witnesses. Crime scene photographs provide easy storage and retrieval of data on the crime scene, effectively placing the judge and jury at the crime scene, and giving the investigator a source of reference as to the location of evidence at the scene. Although markers should be used, photographs do not show the true distances, which can distort color and perceptions, and can be ruined by errors in processing. Field notes begin when the officer gets called to the crime scene. Most information should be learned by asking who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. When recording the crime scene on video, record the parameter, walking increasingly closer to the objects in question. Officers draw rough sketches at the crime scene, while finished sketches drawn to scale are created later. Sketches may employ the baseline coordinate method, the cross projection method, or the triangulation method.